Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to the Institute for Government today. We're here to do two things. The first of those is to share the findings of a report. It's a research report conducted jointly by Collaborate, which Henry is representing, but also we have the other co-author in here, Dan Crow, who I should point out at some point if you want a really informed opinion on the research. And ourselves, the Institute for Government, and it was supported by the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. And the second thing we are here to do is to have a bit more of a debate about the future and to start thinking about, given the debates that have been in the media lately about outsourcing, what the agenda for public service reform might be for 2015 and beyond, how outsourcing, commissioning of public services might fit within that. Before we start, I want to make a special note of thanks to the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, without whom the work wouldn't have been possible, and specifically to Andrew Barnett, who has been involved in different types of service delivery initiatives for some time, and therefore has a real passion for this topic, which made this happen. And also to Annabelle Davison, who's also got an extra name, which I'm going to add here. Davison Knight, isn't it? Yeah. It's what happens when you get married. You get the extra names, who's been advising us throughout the project. So the panel that we have here today, I will introduce very briefly before they pile in to give huge amounts of insight. We have Dr. Henry Kippen, who is from Collaborate, who's going to present the findings of the research. Michael Coughlin, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Local Government Association. And Helen Stevenson, who is the Director of the Office of Civil Society in the Cabinet Office, and Lord Victor Adewale, who's the Chief Executive of Turning Point, but also the Chair of Collaborate, who have sneakily managed, by virtue of Victor's various associations, to get on the panel twice, which I think is quite an achievement. The format for the event will be very short presentation of the research findings, short notes from the speakers, but then the real focus is on Q&A, discussion, comment from the audience. So I think we should get cracking, but before we do, quick note of our technological advances here at the Institute. We have our Twitter handle there at IFG Events, and we have the hashtag outsourcing. Not perhaps the most accurate one for this event, but one that gets a fair amount of follows, I think, on Twitter. So the other thing I should say is that the event's being recorded, so everything that's said here is on the record. But don't let that stop you from being a little bit controversial if you want to be, or just sort of muffle your name when you say it, when you ask a question. So Henry, if you want to fire us off here.
So never mind the research field, the shock factor, that's the first thing we should say. So I'm Director of Collaborate. We are a think and a do tank, and everybody calls themselves a think and a do tank these days, but we focus on the thinking, the culture and the practice of collaboration in public services. And so we're obviously really pleased to be part of this collaboration here in this office, which is only marginally nicer than our offices in Elephant and Castle. And so the focus today, the focus of this discussion, the whole focus of the panel afterwards will be on the future of commissioning, and therefore, of course, on the future of public services. And in particular, what we focus on in this piece of work, which you don't have in front of you, we're helping the environment by not printing out lots of copies that you'll leave on the tube on the way home alongside the Evening Standard. We're looking at the readiness of those commissioning public services, of those organisations providing them, the public, private and social sector, their readiness, if you like, to meet citizens' needs now, in future, and in an increasingly complex social and economic and operational environment. And so what we, if you like, hypothesize about is whether we can bring some data to bear on a debate that has lots of policy noise around it, lots of media comment, of course, big public examples of market failure, high-profile examples of public service failure, and in the run-up to election, we're going to see increasing dividing lines between the parties in terms of how commissioning should work, and what, if you like, the right balance should be between central and local commissioning, between public and private organisations, and the mix of voluntary and community organisations that should be involved in this mix of delivering public services. We know, of course, in terms of complexity, all of this is happening in a context of rising demand. Every council will have their own versions of the jaws of doom, shifting demographic profile, tough economic conditions despite our recent uptick, and a policy agenda that we know, especially in terms of issues like welfare, is having an uneven impact in different parts of the country and different parts of the community. So our hypothesis in this context, if you like, is an optimist one. It's that commissioning models that really engage, that really get the best out of the social sector, in particular, offer a massive opportunity to make the public service reform agenda work, the open public service reform agenda work, if you like, and most importantly, a big opportunity to do better by those people with multiple, complex, overlapping needs who so often fall through the gaps of traditional service provision. We set up this research knowing there's many barriers, there's many pitfalls, some of which we'll get to this evening, but what we really wanted to do is, if you like, put some data behind the conjecture and talk about the readiness of commissioners and providers from their own point of view. We commissioned 3 surveys of commissioners, social, private sector providers, frontline workers. We ran focus groups, case studies, and we had a range of expert interviews. So a number of perspectives we brought to bear in service areas included adult social care for older people, mental health, drug and alcohol services, special educational needs services, all local, of course, and then some really good in-depth interviews with the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Work and Pensions, which represent clearly some of the big national and controversial commissioning programmes. So we focused on 3 trends, and you'll see this when you get to reading the report. They're laced through the report. Outcomes, risk and innovation, and relationships. And against these trends, we're seeing some key changes happening. We're seeing some key barriers, and we think that they help to frame, if you like, the solutions to be ready for complex commissioning in future. In terms of outcomes, we're seeing a big shift, both nationally and locally, towards working with outcomes. This is perhaps not surprising, but it's happening. 60% of providers we surveyed reported a change in their relationships with the public sector in this direction. Both commissioners and providers, both levels, expected the use of payment by results mechanisms to increase. And there's general support, we found, from all of the research actually, for this direction of travel, on the basis that, of course, it addresses real need and outcomes if done well, rather than rewarding processes, and has the potential to save money not only now, but in terms of future allocative efficiency. So really a kind of enthusiasm about that direction of travel, but also some really quite profound and big concerns, which you'll see reflected in the report. First of all, commissioners and providers both felt we're not good enough at understanding the community, its needs, not only its needs, but its assets, its resources, its networks. We don't understand enough about the root causes of demand, and therefore we can't manage it well enough through the commissioning process. We can't commission well on this basis because that is such a huge part of what commissioning should be, that insight at the top of the commissioning cycle, and that's a really important finding that comes out of the work. Secondly, we don't have the right means or the methods, if you like, to involve the community in co-designing the services that are provided on their behalf. We don't prioritise co-production enough. That's a word that's bandied around a lot. What we found, certainly from the views of people involved in this mix of provision, was that it doesn't figure heavily enough in how services are actually designed and delivered. And thirdly, we don't do enough to enable citizens themselves to hold service providers and service provision to account, through user feedback and contracting perhaps, through, if you like, co-designing payment mechanisms. All of this is to say that instruments like payment by results end up feeling a bit like a blunt instrument to solve what is an increasingly complex set of problems faced by individuals. So you'll see the quote that heads up this slide. The answer is what the service user values. We're not, from the view of the people we spoke to, well set up to incorporate that into the way that we work. In terms of risk and innovation, we tested the assumption that there's a symbiotic relationship between the two, and that new commissioning arrangements, particularly those involving prime and subcontracting, particularly those at a national level, encourage innovation against outcomes. We found this is not the case, so more than 80% of the providers we surveyed, this was especially prevalent with the smaller social sector providers, are concerned by the impact of payment by results. 80% worried about cost recovery in contracts, 75% worried about access to upfront or working capital. So the financial concerns really to the fore here. And what this means, what this certainly meant in the examples that we learned about, was that innovation is not the end result. Providers become risk averse, perverse incentives are created in the system, and financial survival skews resources away from social purpose and meeting individuals' needs. And you'll see, if anyone's seen some of the media from this report today, there's a headline in there about PBR favouring bigger providers, and that's where that analysis comes from, if you like. This is why. Thirdly, we talked about relationships, a really important part of the work and undervalued, if you like, in the way that we talk about public service contracts. Existing relationships are being broken, new ones are being formed. That's an inevitable part of any reform agenda and is maybe not necessarily surprising, but it's massively significant. And the danger that we heard from the ground level is that, according to both commissioners and providers, is that the distance between the public sector and the community increases. The social sector loses that close relationship with the public sector that allows it to, if you like, co-design commissioning processes. And there's a huge imperative, particularly in prime and sub-models, for prime providers to get better at building relationship upwards and downwards, which is not an easy task. Anecdotal evidence suggests a lot of them have not been particularly good at doing that. We also found that providers and commissioners are responding to these changes by getting their heads around this thing called collaboration, which is still at an early stage. 90% of commissioners that we surveyed said they're encouraging, particularly social sector providers, to collaborate to bid for contracts. So the sector itself feels like, obviously, it has to. Almost half of the providers we surveyed reported an increase in partnership working already and a big increase in subcontracting. And most providers felt that they would need increasingly to collaborate to understand what it might mean and how you do it, not only to play their social role, but to survive in future. There's a big question about whether everybody in that mix of organisations is well set up enough to do that. And that's something that hopefully the panel can speak to. We also pull out some recommendations, which are partly from us, partly from the people that we spoke to through the research. Obviously, big challenges here. What do we do about them? Well, I'd like to leave that slightly open so we can have a discussion and we can take some views from the panel. But what we do in the report is we draw a few key principles. We profiled, and the pictures here, if anybody is a geographer, will show you Brixton, they'll show you South Tyneside, and they'll show you a street in Cambridge. We profiled Lambeth Council's outcomes framework for children and young people. We profiled South Tyneside's homelessness consortium and the MEAM multiple needs approach in Cambridge as examples of different approaches to commissioning, which were addressing some of the issues that we set out. These are different contexts. They're aiming at different outcomes. They're different approaches, but some principles are common to all three. And where we saw success, I think it was inevitably local, if you like, addressing complex needs in a place. It's bounded. Integration feels more plausible at a local level. We've seen examples of that happening. Inevitably integrated, working across sector silos, being very determined about doing that and meeting the holistic needs of individuals and families. Preventative, so working very obviously to address the drivers of demand and the root causes of problems in people's lives. And of course, there's some big national programs like Troubled Families aimed at addressing some of that. Now, whether or not the payment mechanisms in those initiatives are set up to help to do that is another question. Inevitably relational and co-produced, strong relationships not only between citizens and services, but between the social sector and the public sector commissioning, the things that they do. And a degree of balance, using payment mechanisms that balance risk and innovation and not necessarily jumping on PBR as the silver bullet to solve all of these problems. So that's the challenge. There's a set of principles and really part of what I think we have to discuss is how we can make some of that work at scale. Of course, there's a huge issue around cost and risk that needs to be addressed. And in the end, all of this is pointing towards the principles that we can use to start to develop the readiness of the social sector, the private sector and the public sector to get better at commissioning services against increasingly complex needs in future. So hopefully you guys can tell us how.
Thank you very much, Henry. Now we'll hear from Helen Stevenson about some of the things that government is doing to try and make improvements in this area and what's really working for them.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really interesting. Thank you, Henry, for the kind of background to the research. Great to be part of Collaborate. We've been involved in it since its inception, so it's really great to celebrate this piece of work tonight. I want to kind of respond, if you like, from a government perspective and tell you a bit about what government is doing to try and support this new commissioning environment in which we're operating. And firstly, it's important to say that commissioning matters hugely. We spend over £200 billion on public services, and government's committed to opening up those public services, increasing user choice and driving up quality. So we recognise, though, that we're only going to be able to do that if the people who buy those services have the skills, the support, the flexibility to commission services in creative ways and intelligent ways. So we recognise, I think it's really important to acknowledge, that commissioners do face a huge challenge. Understanding what a service needs to achieve, understanding who can deliver what, judging different proposals, aligning this with the priorities of your organisation, doing it in a context often of fiscal constraint and perhaps increasing demand is a challenging job, and we need to support people to do that and to do it well. Secondly, commissioners need to act within a set of rules. They don't exist in a vacuum. They have to operate within EU procurement law, UK law, regulation, government guidance, the guidance of their own organisations. And we need to make sure that commissioners are not hamstrung by those laws and regulations, but they're proportionate to the outcome that we hope to achieve. And thirdly, just to say it does take two to tango, that intelligent commissioning is built on an intelligent relationship between the commissioner and the commissioned. And there's a developing understanding that I think we need to build, is what we need, how we achieve together an understanding of the impact that we want to achieve and purchase through commissioning, and for organisations to be able to demonstrate that impact and evidence how the high quality services that they provide. Those are the challenges I think we face from a commissioning perspective, and the government is doing a number of things to address that. First of all, it's about training and supporting commissioners. Government set up a commissioning academy. It's a central government supported development programme for commissioners, both at a national and a local level. And the aim being to create a cadre of intelligent commissioners who are able to take on board a whole raft of kind of issues. In particular, we have a whole section in that on commissioning the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, and on commissioning for social enterprise. The aim is to see 1,500 commissioners trained within 3 years, and we're on track to do that. But I think it's important, I recognise there's a huge cadre profession of commissioners, and we are at the foothills of that as well. I want to talk a bit about social investment and about outcomes and how we use social investment as a way of purchasing outcomes. But I'm going to talk a little bit more in a little more depth about that in a minute, so I'll just touch on that here. The second point I think to make is that we are freeing commissioners up. We've recently negotiated a whole range of changes to EU procurement law, which has given commissioners more flexibility and taken a whole raft of contracts and services out of the need to procure at the kind of more complicated and complex EU level. We've also sought to give more power to the local level, to take it from the central to the local, to give more power to the local communities, from local commissioners, from police commissioners, NHS, to give more power to a local level to see services commissioned at a local level where they are delivered. And that part of that is also removing ring fences from local government spending to enable them to do that. And then finally, we're helping the VCSE in particular, supporting them to become better at engaging with commissioners. So we're running a whole series of commercial masterclasses for the VCSE. We're bringing together the private sector, who are often quite good at this, to work together in partnership with the voluntary community sector to work together to learn how to be better at responding to bidding for public service contracts. I think that's a good example of collaboration between the public, the private and the voluntary sector. We've put £10 million into an investment and contract readiness fund, which is enabling the VCSEs to build their capacity and capability to bid for public sector contracts and to take on and attract investment. And then we're giving VCSEs all organisations, greater access to government data, and this is enabling them to demonstrate their impact. So for instance, in the Justice Data Lab, this allows charities who are working in the offender rehab space to be able to track the performance of their interventions and the impact on reoffending rates of the people who they're supporting. That's a key thing to understand the impact that an organisation is having on the services they're delivering. But the report does say a lot about PBR, and so I think it's important that we just spend a bit of time focusing on social impact bonds and their potential to both transform the way that we commission and to enable more social sector organisations to take part in payment by results contracts. Most of the focus has been on SIBs as a way in which the VCSE can take part in public sector contracts. But I think increasingly, certainly from the centre of government, we're really interested in the way in which they can help us reform commissioning. And the way in which they can do that is they are an excellent way in which we can commission for complex needs. Departments find it very difficult when you're dealing with an issue of a complex and intractable social need, often to commission appropriately for that particular need. And it's where they are able to come together to commission for an outcome rather than an activity that I think we can see some real reform to some of the commissioning practice, particularly in areas of real intractable, complex social needs. SIBs can help people move outside of their siloed funding streams. Department can come together and shared outcomes, local authorities can come together with providers around shared outcomes, which enable them to pay for the outcome, as I said, rather than just the intervention or the activity. SIBs add to the enabling and innovative approaches to which some of the areas that you've highlighted, that we can start to invest in innovation rather than be very specific about the kind of intervention that we're looking to purchase. So SIBs do share a lot of the advantages to the Commissioner of payment by results contracts. They increase innovation in public service delivery, they can improve performance and reduce costs, and they increase and accelerate learning about what works. But I think they have a real crucial advantage that take us beyond just mainstream normal PBR contracts. First of all, they diversify the supplier base. Commissioners want a diverse market, a diverse supplier base. They want to be able to work with organisations of different scale and different ability. SIBs allow that to happen, and they do that by de-risking the contracts for the providers. The financial risk for these contracts sits with the investor, not with the provider, and that's a key difference between a normal PBR contract. Secondly, they enable us to leverage investor expertise, and they create a third party, if you like, in the relationship between a commissioner and a provider. Very often that expertise can be subject specific, but it's also about supporting particularly social organisations to build their business capability and indeed to demonstrate more rigorously the impact that they're having. And finally, what they do is they enable us to align behind a common goal, which is to achieve a social impact. It means that the social investor, the provider who's a social organisation, and the commissioner is able to align behind the impact that they want to achieve, and all of us then in that partnership are able to aligned behind that social goal. So again, this is not, let's not oversell the amount of SIBs that we have, or the way, the extent to which we are on that journey. We are at the foothills of this as a commissioning mechanism. There's 14 SIBs, only 14 in the UK. That's great, it's more than it was, but it's one more to launch soon. So there's definite progress, there's definite appetite. We have a centre for SIBs in the Cabinet Office who are looking to increase the number and the quality, and to simplify the process that it is to set those up, and to shorten the time that it takes to set up a SIB. And we have set up a £60 million joint fund with Big Lottery Fund to enable, to provide top-up outcome payments for SIBs in complex policy areas. So we're in the business of proof of concept. We want to support these kinds of constructs as they go forward as a way of reforming commissioning. We won't transform commissioning overnight, as this research really helpfully articulates, but we are committed to working with commissioners and to working with particularly the social sector to create an environment in which we can commission for some of these intractable and difficult social issues.
You're next. So thank you very much, Helen. Next up, we have Victor, who is going to give some of his thoughts, probably from a number of different perspectives, I suspect, but particularly his experience as being a provider with Turning Point.
So I kind of start by talking about, I always hate people who start with so, but there you go. Can I start by talking about things with my Chair of Collaborate hat on, because I was very keen to establish Collaborate partly because I'm passionate about this agenda, because it is the future of services to the public as we know it. And can I thank Gulbenkian again for just being with us on the Collaborate journey, of which this is part of. But also, those people who know me know this is very rare, to thank and praise the Cabinet Office and the Minister and Helen for sticking with us, because it is rarer than it should be for government to invest in the risk of innovative thinking and innovation in and of itself, which I think is a key role of government, but it's actually quite rare. So, thank you for sticking with us on the journey, being on the ground floor. And this report is part of the opening up, I think, of a critical debate, some of which is actually built into the language. I don't know about you, and there are far cleverer people than me in this room, but when we talk about commissioning, I note that the terminology drifts quite easily between commissioning, procurement, as though they're the same thing. And I have to say, from a provider point of view, it is blindingly obvious that there is a difference somewhere. somewhere. And when people talk about rules, they usually mean procurement, particularly when they want the rules to be in their favour. And when they talk about, or don't talk about, outcomes, they talk about commissioning. And I have to say that for me, there's a huge value in really getting to grips with what we mean by commissioning, as opposed to what do we mean? What are we holding commissioning to account for? Particularly as the need for services to the public across a whole range of areas. I mean, I happen to sit on the board of NHS England. Believe me, it's getting more complex. The complexity of demand is increasing. And it strikes me that one of the issues that this report speaks to is the need for commissioning version 2. And I know that the media have focused on, PBR and the effect on small charities and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that's a sexy headline. It's not as cool as saying, what we need is a commissioning version 2. But we desperately in need of a conversation that produces a commissioning model, which actually has, in my view, the following elements. Firstly, a demand that the process starts with mechanisms that understand the needs of individuals and or communities first, because that shifts where the attention needs to be. And I'm really pleased that at the outset, within this work, there is a real focus on what the frontline and community experiences, because frankly, at the other end of the commissioning process, we waste billions, and it is billions, on processes that don't deliver for communities. Secondly, I think we need to be, we don't say criticising work that I've been involved in, but I guess this report should start a discussion, but I think it needs to start a discussion about the need to really radically look at service design processes, because again, when we talk about procurement, genuinely we mean procuring the same services, only cheaper. When we talk about commissioning, we should be talking about actually redesigning services in the interests of the user. And by the way, the more complex the user, the more bespoke the design needs to be. Therefore, in the current circumstances, we need to be prepared to decommission. I know that's the word that we use, but actually ultimate flexibility within the design of public services is critical. The challenge is that we've built up all over the country, which is why I was so keen, sounds like I'm praising government too much actually, but why I was so keen that Francis Maud took up the idea of the Commissioning Academy with such enthusiasm, because actually we've got these structures that are inbuilt, have an inbuilt desire to protect themselves, and actually Commissioning 2 needs to deconstruct some of those structures in the interests of the taxpayer, to be honest. So I think this report doesn't present all the answers, but I think it asks some pretty fundamental questions about what the future of commissioning actually is. And I think it talks a lot more about commissioning than it does procurement, which is exactly what I wanted it to do. Secondly, ask questions about the nature of collaboration. And I think, everybody I've noticed, maybe it's because we set up Collaborate and Henry's just damn cool and, people want to talk about collaboration. But actually, when you deconstruct what it means to me a number of things. One, there's a skill set that's missing often, which is about the skill, which is often assumed, of building relationships across boundaries. It is a skill. It is something that can be learned. There are models. How do you build trust? How do you build shared outcomes? It is a skill. It has to be learned, and we're really, really bad at it in this country. I mean, it's appalling, right? Secondly, I think we need repeatable, reliable models of understanding individual and community need. And thirdly, we need the kind of leadership that's able to really question and challenge current provision, almost as an ongoing behaviour. If it exists, there has to be a question as to what is the outcome that it doesn't matter who's providing it actually, whether it's not-for-profit, public in the standard form, or private, it needs to be challenged on that basis, because the work that I do at Turning Point, and I'll say this and shut up, is often as a result of failure. So when we look at you know, the fact that 1 in 11 children will be going home to parents who misuse substance misuse. You know, there's a system failure in there. When you look at the fact that if we don't do something about dual diagnosis, alcohol misuse, we're going to need 20% more hospital beds. We're supposed to be going in the opposite direction than we currently got now. There's a system failure there. It requires a complete. If we look at the issues around parity of esteem, for instance, there is a system between mental health and physical health, system failure, all of which demand a different way of commissioning services. With me? So this report, which I would recommend to you, it's a brilliant read before, you know, stoke up a nice fire tonight and read it before you go to bed. It starts a critical debate on which the lives of people outside this room, I suspect, absolutely need us to have in order that the outcome is a new form of commissioning which is understood and for which commissioners, regardless of where they are held accountable for delivering. Enough said.
And Michael, let's hear about what's going on in local government.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, fascinating to hear the speakers and the way that what they're saying absolutely aligns with what's going on in local government to a very significant extent. But clearly, commissioning as a topic, as an approach, as a subject doesn't exist in isolation. It is part of a massive public sector agenda for change that's driving policy, organisational, structural change, and I think most fundamentally, driving and seeking to achieve a culture change, the like of which we probably haven't seen in local government, probably since the Victorian times when they were putting drains down and improving sewage in, sewer facilities in cities across the country. So that policy landscape is in part driving the changes that you've heard the speakers talk about, but also it creates a change overhead, if you like. It's an additional burden to cope with that level of change, and collaboration clearly is going to be the order of the day as we go forwards, and people are not going to be able to survive in the current climate or provide what they provide or achieve the outcomes they provide without collaborating. But that does create an additional burden, particularly in terms of time, and that burden comes for many local councils on top of the most challenging financial climate many have experienced probably since they were created in 1974, with a number of local authorities facing budget reductions of anything up to sort of 47.5% over a 4-year period. And if you put yourselves in the shoes of those council leaders and those council chief executives, suffering a very nearly 50% cut in your budget over a 4-year period requires quite adventurous and quite bold and brave decision making. So set against that and the policy agenda change, also there's the growing demographic changes going on, growing demand upon local authorities and local councils, and indeed the public sector as a whole. And it was a stat that I heard today that kind of chimed, because the figures are quite alarming, but when you unpack them, that you kind of understand them really. But I think it's something in the order of 100,000 people who are 65 today will celebrate their 100th birthday in 1949. So the longevity and the increasing levels of frailty and the pressure in the system that creates. 2049 is a long way away, and you know, I apologise if you're 65 or over in the room. And I think one of the contextual factors that I think it is easy to overlook, and it's not necessarily a judgmental statement, it is the impact of local politics on what local authorities do and how national policies and national initiatives are interpreted and applied at a local level. And indeed the hashtag outsourcing will be embraced by many in local authorities and will be absolutely rejected out of hand by a good number of others. So there is this, it's a fairly simplistic polarisation of views of local councils. There are 353 different councils across the country, and I think the comment there about innovation is going on in probably the biggest public service lab in the country, which is local government. 350 authorities trying to find their own way and identify what is going to be best for their particular community. So whilst we loosely say the local government sector, it is incredibly diverse, and any generalisation is fundamentally flawed. So generally speaking, commissioning in the past has typically been in local authorities by service-specific areas, commissioning probably particular services against a certain community group, typically adults and children's. The recent pressures in that context has, I think, encouraged councils to think much more strategically, has to elevate up their commissioning activity to a more strategic level. But it does mean, and this isn't, again, a judgment or a criticism, but I think some of the expertise and some of the experience and some of the skill sets that you've heard about haven't existed to the degree that they need to in light of the future circumstances authorities are facing. However, a number of authorities, given the diversity, have come to this very rapidly and very enthusiastically. There are any number of fantastic examples of where authorities are commissioning in very, very sophisticated and cleverly nuanced ways. Some examples would be Wiltshire County Council, who have moved very rapidly from commissioning adult social services in a more traditional sense of often blocks of care for recipients of the service, through to a payment by results system based on the numbers of people who no longer need the service as a result of going through the reablement process, which means they are taken out of the service. So it's a complete rethinking of what you're commissioning, and it's genuinely, I think, one of the best examples we have of commissioning for outcomes as opposed to commissioning services. And they have made, I think, unusually, the payment by results system work around preventative outcomes that are being sought. Oldham Metropolitan Borough Council did some ethnographic research in the way you've heard Victor talk about, genuinely really getting to know at a fine level of detail and granularity each and every one of your service recipients, and completely recommissioning the provision of children's services, not to commission the service in a different way, but to deconstruct it from ground zero and to provide something completely different to achieve different and better outcomes from those youngsters. Suffolk County Council, working with Acevo and Social Finance and the Young Foundation and Equity Plus, to deliver a complete programme across the whole of Suffolk around to create a sustainable market of service providers, particularly around young people, I think. So there's some really innovative and exciting practice. Hundreds of examples also, I have to say, coming through from the work that the LGA has done. And again, I wouldn't want Helen to feel overly pumped up here, but working with the Cabinet Office in a very, very positive relationship to have a strong input from a local government sector into the Commissioning Academy, and a high proportion of people going through the Academy coming from local authorities. Indeed, we had an event on Monday which was celebrating the Academy 1 year on, and the Chief Executive of Horsham District Council, which is Francis Maud's local authority, was able to speak of his experience in the Commissioning Academy and the outcomes it's achieved for them. I think they're going forward in the way the report sets out, particularly from the local authority sector. I think there is a fundamental issue here. The scale of the change and the scale of the financial pressures in local authorities are requiring a number of them to fundamentally move away from models of service delivery through to models of demand prevention or demand management. And you do get the sense that maybe commissioning version 2.0 has to be about how do you commission for not the delivery of services based on current assessments of need as it is presented, but how do you commission preventative activities that stop that demand ever manifesting itself to the public sector? And I think that goes across both health and social care. Current models tend to, and the danger for local authorities in current potentially commissioning models when you're awarding work to organisations, individuals, have a danger of locking in current ways of working and current costs. And when you need to be as fleet as foot and agile as many local authorities need to be, there's a reluctance to lock some of those into formally contractually binding arrangements. So this ability of commissioning version 2 to be much more fleet of foot, much more flexible, but also recognise the needs of the providers as well as the service recipients need to be protected as well. I think there is, using the Wiltshire model, a real issue around payment by results and defining what we mean by results. You can pay by inputs, and that traditionally has been a legitimate way of funding and paying. You can have payment by outputs, but much more important is payment by outcomes. But when those outcomes are longitudinal, when they are preventative, and actually you're paying somebody to stop something happening, how do you then measure, in order to make the payment, that they've stopped something happening with a degree of confidence that can be tied down into a quasi-contractual commercial relationship? And I think those are some of the challenges that we need to think about going forward. I would fundamentally agree the whole issue about relationships, not only with the recipients or the residents or the customer and the service or the outcomes that are being sought, have to change absolutely fundamentally, but the relationships between the commissioners and the providers. And in speaking about this to Henry before I came this evening, was just talking about some of the well-trained, very competent professional staff who find themselves in commissioning roles, who are finding that it's a fundamental challenge to their professional training, but not only their training, their sense of self-esteem, their sense of self-worth, and their very self-identity. If I am a provider of service that means that you immediately are better off than you were, and I'm now being asked to commission for outcomes, and I can't see that until it's well beyond my lifespan. It fundamentally changes both people's role, both in the workplace and potentially outside of the workplace, in quite a psychological way. And when often I hear comments coming back from organisations about, well, we're having trouble with the culture change bit, it is fundamentally about changing the providers and the commissioners' mindset and attitude and psychology about their role in quite, as I say, quite a fundamental way. Having said that, so we need to work on that, need to focus on that, I think. Having said that, I think there's really grounds for optimism. The report makes that comment. There are grounds for optimism. The fact that the report prompts this debate and this discussion has to be good news, and we need to seize this opportunity and go forward from here. I think there is something about realistic expectations, and that's not to say ambitious and aspirational, but a sense of realism if we fundamentally believe that commissioning for social outcomes is different from commissioning for widgets or products. We need to be realistic about the time it takes and the expectations we have around doing that. We need to continue with the efforts that we're making through the Commissioning Academy and through Collaborate and other discussions taking place to develop this different model that is more nuanced, that is more socially oriented, that is more outcome oriented and is more people oriented. We need to continually learn from the best, and there are many, many good examples of where really powerful, good strategic commissioning is taking place, and we need to find ways of sharing that. And I do think we need to take this further forward. Irene Lucas, who was ex-chief executive at South Tyneside, to use a phrase to capture the strength of collaboration, used to finish every presentation she did was, none of us is as good as all of us. And there is something about the collective effort that we need to make behind this. And just as a vague thought, as I walked across St James's Park this afternoon and this evening to come across here this afternoon, I just wondered whether this report actually prompts the need for a commissioning commission.
That's very good. I'm about to do the customary thing of abusing the position of the chair to sneak in the first question. And that's to ask really, we're right in the run-up now, I think, already to the 2015 general election. We're already getting positioning from all parties about what their stance and policy positions are going to be going into that. We're getting the emergence of a debate around public service reform where really, I think, it would be fair to say all parties aren't quite sure what they're going to say quite yet, but they might need to say something about it. And they're sort of, in classic ways, looking for big ideas. My question is, should they be looking for big ideas? And if so, which ones? Does anyone want to take that one on?
Well, I'm a crossbench peer, so I slag them all off, don't I? So I guess. I mean, my fear is that, well, first of all, it would be really good if they don't start going backwards, because both main parties, and indeed the Lib Dems, you know, some of the work on collaboration, some of the work on designing services from the ground up, commissioning for communities, started under the last government. It was carried on and supported by this government. The need for rethinking commissioning in ways that look at risk in different forms, PBR exactly, have continued, and you know we've had the support of the Cabinet Office. So my worry is, in the white heat of the nonsense that goes on before an election, actually there's a tendency for things to become really risk averse and people to start dumping things that look risky. And so my first point would be, I hope the politicians keep the debate open and keep discussing. My second would be that I think that in this country we are desperately in need of a credible vision for the future of services to the public, by which I don't mean public service. I've deliberately not used the word public service. If you just talk about public services, people think, they automatically think, they shouldn't, but they do. Lowest common denominator, you know, lime green walls, no choice, and the private sector is seen as something else. It's more like luxury. But post-banking crisis, I'm starting to ask my question, what is a public service? And I think, just as we had the vision that created the welfare state and all this sort of stuff, given where we've placed local government, which is the major provider, significant, without them we're stuffed, we need a coherent policy vision for how all this fits together going forward, which takes into account the current demand, future demand, and the current methodologies, which underpins the point that Michael made, I think, very powerfully, which is what we're expecting of all providers of service to the public, whether it be public, private or not for dividend, not for profit, is a culture shift, the like of which we've not really experienced in this country before. So I'm hopeful, I guess, that our politicians have got the virtue, the skill to actually provide us with some politics and some vision about this stuff, because without it, it's very difficult to actually structure a debate that takes people forward. And I'm fearful of a kind of reductionist, it's one thing or the other, it's a risk-averse approach. I think that would be deadly for future generations and for this one. Because actually, getting to 100 is highly likely if you live around here. If you live in one of the 15 poorest boroughs in the country, you'd be damn lucky. And it's those people that cost a fortune. Forget about the morality of it.
Does anyone else want to come in there? Henry?
Probably won't be that surprising to hear that I agree with most of what Victor's just said. I think there's a difference between an agenda for improvement and an agenda for transformation. I think they're two really very different things, and I think if you're going to talk about transformation, it's a political economy issue. It goes beyond public service, it goes beyond the wit of the public sector to provide services against those issues. If you like, for local authorities, you have there's three levels, isn't there? There's stuff you can do, there's stuff you need to do in partnership with others. Public health is a good example. And then there's this third rail of things that you know need to be done in your area. You have the clout to work against them, but aren't being done currently. So if you look, the interesting thing about Oldham, Michael mentioned, is one of the first things they did after, in trying to demonstrate that they're a good cooperative council, trying to demonstrate what that might mean, was to go through this process, if you like, of ethnographic research, look at the issues that people are facing, pick up some of the language about living standards and the language of Julie Runwin when she says that the high street is the new front line of public services. You bear that in mind. They realised that the biggest issue and the biggest barrier to people getting into work, which in turn was a huge driver of demand for them, was the cost of transport into Manchester. The tram didn't work. It was more expensive to get a bus from the poor north of Manchester than it was from the richer south, should I say, into town. First thing they did wasn't a service, it was sitting on the table and bullying the transport company. And I think, if you like, that's a blunt example of what transformation and what services the public and what collaboration around them might mean.
Very good. I'll give the other panellists a chance to come in a second once we go to other questions. Does anyone want to ask a question from the audience? Can I take Andrew and then in the front row?
Thank you, Tom. Andrew Barnett from the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. And actually, thank you very much for thanking us, because we've been very pleased to be associated with this project. And Michael used the term grounds for optimism, and I think that those ring true, I guess, for everybody who's listened to what everybody has said, and especially so in the context of, I guess, where I started, which was seeing two possible scenarios. One, a scenario under which PBR would relentlessly drive up performance, i.e. better outcomes, and the other, that it would produce outcomes which were in some way diminished because they were easier to measure, and it would drive services apart and therefore less well meet the needs of people whose needs are who have complex needs. I think from what I've heard this evening is that the answer to those scenarios are actually too polarized, and and actually it's altogether more nuanced than that. But I'm still left with the question, which I'll ask, which is who's going to pay for the innovation? Because Helen talked about some of the innovation being borne by those who carry the risk if you're investing in a SIB, for example. But actually my sense is that innovation is a longer process than that, and it's easy to invest in something which has already been created, tested, and is ready to scale. It's much harder to invest in something which is highly experimental and may fail. So my question is, who'll pay for that?
Just before we come to the innovation question and who's going to pay for it, we'll take the question at the front as well, and then you can sort of pick and choose the ones you can answer best, but definitely answer both.
Thanks. I'm Claire Pelham, Chief Executive of Leonard Cheshire, and I think we're the largest voluntary sector provider of adult social care. And I've got two questions, one for everybody in the room, which I'll ask now so we can all think about it, which is I'd be really interested to know how many people in this room, because we all live somewhere, know what their local authority practices on commissioning, whether it's input-based or outcome-based. And then while we're reflecting on that one, I'd be interested in the views of the panel on the context for commissioning. Because I think we sometimes think about commissioning as if it operates in a vacuum, but we've heard about the pressures on local authorities, we've heard of what good practice looks like, and as a provider, we see a lot of very different practice on the ground. I mean, interestingly, I was going to quote Wiltshire, where we are one of the providers, as an example of stellar practice, outcome-based, wonderful, amazing to work with. But there are lots of other local authorities where practice is really very, very disappointing. And it's input-based commissioning, and what a lot of reputable providers do is withdraw from those competitions. So you're left there with the less than reputable providers, where the assessment is based only on price. And the people who feel the input of that, the impact of that, are the people on the end of those services, who are very unable to speak up for themselves quite often. Disabled people, older people, people who need advocates to make their case. And so I'd be interested in your reflections on the context in which commissioning is working. And that's why I started by asking whether we all, articulate, intelligent, well-informed, interested people, do we all know what our local authorities are doing in our name? Because if we don't, how are we going to arrive at a situation where local authorities are encouraged to put into practice good outcome-based commissioning?
Well, there's two stellar questions there to get your teeth stuck into. One about innovation, and I suppose two questions. Approach of your council. I don't think that's one for you to answer necessarily. Don't want to fess up to our own ignorance, including my own here. And then on the commissioning context and how much that matters.
Shall I have a go at the... Can I just come back to the first question, which is the main part? I mean, I suppose, similar to Victor, I think rather than coming up with single-ticket big ideas, which we know in the current context of how we work are unlikely to succeed across the patch, both geographically across all local authorities, let alone across different sectors, private, public and voluntary and community sectors, I think. So I kind of feel this isn't necessarily formal LGA line, but you kind of think that values, big values, that really resonate, that create that sense or underpin the sense of the vision of not just the public services, but the sort of country and the sort of community and the sort of society you want to be, would be refreshing to see those enunciated in the manifestos going forward. I think then with the values in place, difficult though it is, and slightly less controllable, having big ideas controlled from the centre, allowing things to occur at the bottom, to grow in the communities, to grow from not only the public services that exist in places, but to genuinely grow from communities. And as we shift from perhaps a patriarchal sense of providing services into something that's much more collaborative across all dimensions, we do need to set the framework for that and then allow things to happen at a local level. And you won't be surprised that the LGA produced at its conference last year something called Rewiring Public Services, Rejuvenating Local Democracy, which in one simple document sets out 10 big ideas that would enable that type of framework to be put into place, which is very much about allowing local places, pan-public sector, pan-community, pan-everybody in the area to determine their own future and to have control over their tax and spend decisions in order that the funding that they do have available to them could go to where the need is greatest and where they determine locally where the need is greatest. And there was an alumni event for a leadership group recently where somebody raised the issue and raised their hand and said, actually, you know, I don't doubt that there is enough money in the system, it's just not going to the right places to meet the needs and achieve the outcomes that we want, which is a bit of a heresy in the current climate of austerity and fiscal constraint. But if you think that through, you may come to a different conclusion. The experience of local councils who are innovating is not that it requires a significant upfront investment as you might do in the private sector to innovate around products. Where innovation is coming from is literally in the hothouse of day-to-day activity, with people being given the environment and being given the authority to try things differently at a fairly granular level. And the discussions we've had recently with a variety of other partners and local authorities is if you genuinely adopt a prototyping approach, you're not politically protected, but you're slightly inured from criticism if you're prototyping, because you never fail. You're always learning from what you've prototyped, and you will develop and you'll have a process in place whereby everything you learn gets built back into the system. And what we found, the most innovative councils have been at it a while, but they have persisted at that innovation. They've given staff the freedom and the authority to go away and try things differently. I think probably underpinning that more than anything else is the appetite to risk. and you do have to change your appetite to risk and be a bit more open to things not going quite as you expected and being surprising. I think the context for commissioning is it okay to take all three very briefly?
Oh yeah.
The context for commissioning is exactly as you described. It is a very, very granular system, and as you comment on local authorities, other parts of the public service will be good in some places and not so good in others. We have a highly developed system of what we call in local government sector-led improvement, which is seeking to encourage people to learn from the best, where we share very sensitively soft intelligence around those who aren't doing so well, where we seek to encourage them to do better, where we put them in touch with their peers, who they tend to be more able to speak to openly about their issues, and we're currently working with health and a variety of other partners on how that is spread across the public service more generally. You know, I suppose it comes back to the answer, there isn't one solution to this. It is probably a relatively slow burn, organic, granular process by which we keep at this because we fundamentally believe in the values that underpin what we're doing, and we keep going at it.
Very good. George, go ahead.
I totally agree with that in the sense that there is the idea that there's one model of how we do services and there's one model of commissioning, for me is not the truth anymore. And the Government Innovation Group sits as the space in which government operates, whether that's because of the fiscal situation or because of government policy and approach, has rescinded. We're operating in the space just outside of government, where government can work with the voluntary sector, it can work with business to achieve social impact. And that, to me, is an exciting space. It's an innovative space, because it's in the space where we work together that you can see innovation. And I agree that you don't necessarily, it's not about funding it in an R&D approach. It's about the innovation is there. It's about how do you capture that and enable that to be delivered at a local level. But don't replicate it, scale it where it's replicatable or scalable, but don't try and impose it on every local area. So for me, the outcomes approach that I was describing to you is about, in terms of the context of commissioning, is about not saying this is the innovation, you've got to use it. It's about this is what we want to achieve, this is what we're going to pay for. Go out and do it in any which way you can. It's out there already. The social sector in particular is incredibly creative and innovative about the way in which it kind of achieves social outcomes. But it doesn't have a one approach that will give you the particular specific way in which you're going to deliver that outcome. So kind of fostering innovation and supporting an approach which enables us to buy whatever it is the result is, rather than the particular intervention that that we think might get us to spaces, is the new space that I think we're operating in, and I think is an interesting, innovative, and it's quite an exciting place to be. In terms of the context for commissioning, I think that all of that kind of creates the context. Yes, it is about having to do better with less. There is, you know, we have to find new ways of doing things. It's forcing all of us as public servants to create new ways of doing things in partnership with different people. Government isn't the answer to all of the problems, but we need to find ways of incentivising and creating a set of behaviours that do enable a positive environment in which we can work together through commissioning practice. Now, one of the things we've done that adds to our suite of kind of the way in which we develop that framework is the mystery shopper service, which is a way in which if you've experienced a rubbish example of commissioning or procurement, you can dob that experience in. You can phone the mystery shopper line. That will get investigated, and where possible, and we will look then to influence change and behaviour in that particular incident. And we're looking there at the kind of VCSE experience of commissioning. We're looking at how people are commissioning for social value. I think there's over 500 people have kind of contacted that service, and I think around 75% of those complaints and issues we've been able to talk with people about and get some kind of resolution. So again, early days in the foothills, but it is about changing the environment in which we're all working.
Very good. Does anyone want to come in urgently on this, because I'm sure we've got plenty of other questions?
Just something on the innovation point, because I think innovation there are different levels of innovation. So, I mean, Turning Point has been working on a methodology which engages communities in the design and delivery of integrated health and social care services, which has been evaluated, tested. We know it's cheaper, we know it saves money. For every £1 spent, you save, you know, at least between 5 and 10. We have 250 odd community researchers. We work with a population of well over 100,000. We're working in 2 local authorities on big scalable projects that are about actually replacing services in a completely different way. So why isn't this happening everywhere? And this is where I have some conflict with the idea of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, which I love flowers and I like them blooming, but they take up an awful lot of fertiliser. And there's a question, I think, for government about its role in asking the question, if it's done in A, why isn't it done in B? And I worry about having too loose an approach to that, because if you happen to live in an area where there's no innovation, and not Wiltshire, why the hell should you put up with that? And I think so. There's a challenge. I want to challenge that. Not you know, I'm all for, but I think there's a challenge. I don't think it's so clear cut. In addition, I think that investment in innovation comes at different stages. I mean, you know, if you've got a brand new idea, people will invest in it at different stages depending on where it is. Certainly Turning Point invested a lot of time and money in connected care before it was even, we carried all the risk because we made and I think that's perfectly valid for us to do. I do think that government, both local and national, has a role in pointing out and asking clear questions about why innovation that works isn't taken up and repeated, because if they're not doing that, then there's a danger that it doesn't happen. And I will say this, I think there are 3 types of public service. There are the municipalists, for want of a better term, people who think they've been ingrained into thinking that the services belong to them, not you or me, they belong to them. And the services are political constructs designed to exchange power, basically. The second type are people who've learnt the language of something but never change a service. They never change a service. And the third type, of which we keep repeating them because there's so few of them, Wiltshire being one of them, Birmingham are being forced are another, but they're doing it, and Barnsley and other places like that are so few. What scares me is that the scale of shift isn't fast enough to meet the demand, the need for it. And that's where I think government has to come in. There has to be a role there. Otherwise, the shift is too slow. It's too slow. And we can't afford that.
Very good. Henry?
Just a quick point to add.
So I can say that.
I think if you're a localist, maybe you have a slightly different answer to the money question. And I think part of the issue is that the public service reform, commissioning agenda that we've been talking about, austerity and growth are dealt with in silos as 3 different things. They're talked about in different ways by central government, certainly, and by the public. They're seen as exclusive, they're siloed. If you look at what a city like Manchester is trying to do, maybe around a combined authority, but not necessarily infrastructure, then you're trying to pull public service reform and growth into a situation where they're mutually reinforcing. They're 2 sides of the same coin. So actually, the way you can create and free up investment in doing new things is by effective demand management. You can invest in smart, inclusive growth strategy because your services are much more efficient. They manage demand more effectively, and down the line, they'll save you money. That can only be done within a locality, and clearly there's barriers to that, and there's a big conversation to be had with DWP in future. But I think actually that construct needs to be part of the answer on freeing up space for investment.
Very good. This is good. This is what we want to see. Lauren, can we take this lady here in the checkered coat? And then if we can take Stephen and then Ollie.
Thank you. I'm Sukhvinder Kaur Stubbs, and I'm a director of the Home Group, which is a housing association and actually one of the largest social care providers, so some degree of integration going on there. My question actually is to Victor, picking up on what you said about trust. And I suppose I'm asking you to say a little bit more about that, but also looking to the other panellists to talk about the role of intermediaries, especially voluntary and community organisations, as vehicles, as facilitators for increasing trust at community level. And I just wonder whether that is actually borne out in the research that you've done, and whether there are limits to that.
Very good. One in front.
Sorry, an absolutely fascinating conversation. Sorry, I'm Stephen Aldridge from DCLG. I guess I got an observation, perhaps, and then a question, if that's all right. The observation or question is something we talk about commissioning for outcomes. I think there's a really important point here about being clear about what we mean by an outcome. So take the case of ageing. One way of defining the outcome might be that we want to commission for healthy ageing, and that could be enormously important if we're able to get people to age more healthily. That could have massively beneficial effects for people and on implications for local authorities and others. But it might mean that commissioning for healthy ageing might mean you'd want to intervene to encourage younger people or people in their middle age to change their lifestyles. Whereas if your definition of an outcome is making sure that the needs of today's generation of old people are best met, able to live at home rather than going to care, that will result in a different set of interventions. And maybe we need to think about outcomes over the life course or in some other way. So there's some really interesting issues here, it seems to me, about when we talk about an outcome, what exactly do we mean? And then the other sort of point, and it partly maybe flows from that, is that we haven't really heard much about users today. So who is it exactly that we want to reach through our commissioning? Obviously, depending on how you define the outcome, it will vary. And it may be that, given that we actually want our commissioning to stop people using services, that we may not be particularly concerned about users. But we haven't heard much of alternative ways of getting the right outcomes, for example, through personal budgets. You could say that just let funding follow choices, give people personal budgets. Why do we need to worry about all this stuff about collective provision of services? Sorry, that's a massive set of questions. But
I think we're going to have a few more of these as well. So, Ollie, do you want to ask something?
Thanks very much, Ollie Hilbury from the Making a Red Art Matter Coalition. I wanted to pick up on this idea of service design and the way in which the current system completely disincentivises providers out there from talking to each other and thinking about how they might want to design better multi-agency interventions. And a colleague from social finance said the other day, when we want to build a new tower block, we commission for the design of that tower, the build of that tower, and the day-to-day management of that tower once it's built. But in the social sector, we completely miss out the design part. In fact, we do that in-house, we do that in our commissioning offices, and then we put out the build and the run to the sector. So it feels like we're missing out on the ideas and the kind of innovation of the providers and the service users out there. And what can we do in the commissioning world to commission for design?
Very good questions. I'll give the panel a chance to respond to some of those at one time. I think pick one each. And then I think we've got so many questions from the audience that afterwards I'm probably just going to ask, actually, I think half questions are normally comments. So I'm going to just ask for a round of comments from various people in the audience to get everyone involved.
Okay, I'll pick up very directly the question from Savinda here about valuing innovation. I mean, what we do talk about in the report, I picked up a copy and I flicked through just to check whether we did address your concerns. And we do talk about in here valuing innovation outside of the contract, which may be a slightly mealy-mouthed way of saying we really need to understand the value of the social sector in building relationships, whether they're directly with service users or directly with commissioners, playing a part in, if you like, the resilience of communities. And the contracting mechanism doesn't always recognise that. A shift from grants to contracts in terms of the way organisations relate to the public sector probably cuts against that. We need to find new ways of, if you like, keeping organisations that aren't well set up to involve themselves in complex contracting in that mix of organisations that can help keep localities alive. And I don't think we at all hit the answer to that, but that certainly was flagged by a lot of the people we spoke to as a big issue.
Can I pick up on the service design point? I think two things. Again, coming back to the idea of commissioning for outcomes, you're actually paying as part of that for a service design, because you specifically do not go with a kind of clear idea about what the service is going to look like. You go with the idea of the outcome you want to achieve. And then the second thing is just around the changes that have come in as a result of kind of the EU work, and that is about the real focus on the pre-market engagement. And that, so, you know, for so often you had organisations going out to market with a very clearly defined agenda, which, as you said, had been sorted out in the office. But there's a real focus now on something that I think the Minister has really pushed as well, that it's far more intelligent to be able to go to market, talk to the market before you go into the commissioning process, so that you have an understanding of what the market thinks the best way in which you can respond to this particular issue is. And I think we've got to see that come through in terms of the behaviours of commissioners.
Victor and then Michael.
Just on the trust issue, which, hi, Sukhvinder, a couple of things. One, we've touched upon this, but I think it's critical, and I hope that Collaborate will be able to make offers in this area. When people talk about trust, they see it as a kind of either a given, if you get people in the room, they'll start to trust each other, or something that you can take for granted that can be. Actually, I think that trust and building trust is a core skill. You know, there are ways of doing it and there are ways of not doing it. One of the things that's critical, and one of the things that you'll find in every situation where trust has been established, is that there is a common understanding of the context, i.e. why they are there, why people are there, the orientation bit of any, you know. So people are orientated to the same challenge. They all understand why they're there, who they are, what they are. If people are orientated, you actually get trust. If you don't have trust, you can't set goals. If you don't have goals, you can't have commitment. If you can't have commitment, you can't have delivery. And there's a cycle. It's a well-researched cycle. It's called the Drexler-Sibbett cycle, and it works. And you can bet your life any situation where there's a group of people where trust has not been established, or where there's a dysfunctional group, you can bet your life that one bit of that cycle is missing, and you will have to return to it in order to build trust. So there's a bit of this which is about the skills that we will need to build in order to move forward. Just very quickly on the outcomes thing, I'm always struck by, when we do the connected care work, one of the things that I'm struck by is the pushback from the, for want of a better term, the people who own the means of production, wherever they are, who think they've got the outcome sorted. And the problem is, and Helen touched upon this, is that actually the outcome is the thing that needs to be co-designed with the people who receive the services. And it's really quite dangerous. We do waste billions by deciding what the outcome is going to be. For all kinds of very good reasons, but they're usually the wrong ones. So there's a bit in this process of commissioning too, which is about how do you engage in the design of outcomes, which, by the way, is a clue as to how you get the service design.
Michael.
I was just going to make one very quick point about a report produced last year by Barry Quirk, Design for Public Services, which I think was done in conjunction with the Design Council, and we were sat yesterday afternoon with the Design Council talking about how might you adopt a design approach to children's services, for instance, which is a quantum leap away from a tower block, but you know, and has some sensitivities. So there is that discussion already taking place, and I've seen that emerge probably in the last 18 months or so, the introduction of design as an approach to public services, which is, I think, fairly fresh. I suppose just come back to the complexity of the question about outcomes, and clearly achieving an outcome for someone that they live longer, more healthily, will be attached to any number of other outcomes that they might want to achieve for themselves. And if you do the absolute, most fundamental research with them, there will be hundreds of outcomes that individuals want when you listen to them properly for them and their communities. I guess the nature of politics, both at the national and local level, is to recognise that in a resource-limited environment, which we have always been, not just recently, the political decisions are about which outcomes are given priority, which outcomes are to be focused on as a matter of priority, and how are those outcomes best going to be delivered. So I think the answer to your question is you would probably want to deal with the older person who wants to live longer, more healthily, as well as the middle-aged person who needs to change their lifestyle now, as well as the teenager thinking about whether they should decide to smoke or not. And it's all those all the time across the whole of a population and for individuals. The fundamental role of, I think, the political discussion is to identify how in the current climate, and indeed the historical climate, one goes about addressing that multiplicity of outcomes with resources one has at one's disposal.
Can I just say very quickly? That's what you've just said there is absolutely true, but what we have found in actually going into communities and working with them and structuring that work in an appropriate way is that, you know what, they understand that too, and that they understand complexity, and the poorer the community, the more they understand of that, and the angrier they are that actually the people that they pay and vote for to understand it don't. And their solutions are often multifaceted, multi-interventioned, and designed, and a lot of these services look nothing like what we currently provide and speak to all of those issues. It's really quite amazing. But it is possible, but it requires exactly the sort of stuff that you've been talking about in terms of culture shift.
It's very interesting. We're running very low on time. We've got 5 minutes left, which means I think that we've probably got time for about 5 1-minute max contributions from the audience, which means fierce competition, which will be decided completely arbitrary, as one person from the back, one person from the next quintile along, and so forth through to the front, and Lauren is the arbitrator. So if you go with the microphone to the back of the room first. Oh, there is one already. Perfect.
Michael, you mentioned, I think it was you, Mike, culture change. Was it you, Mike? Was it? Only 10% of culture changes have ever succeeded. And so the key thing to get transformational change, which Henry was saying, we've got to get collaborative leadership ingrained in how the whole people work. Now, I don't know whether anyone's done an assessment of is a particular group, are they collaborative? Is the whole collaborative style there? And I bet you it's not. The other thing to recognise is that people are important. And actually, there are networks, informal networks, dotted throughout organisations and communities. There are people there who are trusted. There are people there who are highly influential. They are hidden leaders and hidden collaborators. Those people need to be found because it's the 80-20 rule. We work on them and you can change things. So you need a radically changed approach to culture change and looking at these things. Just a comment.
Very good. One just there.
Hi, Victoria from the Young Foundation. 2 comments really. Firstly, as an organisation built on ethnography and as an ethnographic researcher, very pleased to hear you advocating that as an approach, and absolutely would agree. And then I think the second point for me was that there was a lot of talk about the risk and innovation balance and how we get commissioners to be able to take those risks. And I think there's also a big difference between sort of responsive services, the traditional health and social care, but also actually what we should be looking at as well is very much around preventative services. And there was, touched on that. And where we've been talking about, how we can measure impact and buy outcomes, I think that's a lot harder to do in preventative services. How do we say, how many people we're going to stop falling into crime? How do we measure that we've achieved that? So I think, that's something that needs more consideration as well about how we encourage them to take risks in preventative services as well as kind of more reactive.
Very good. Oh, that's going in the middle. So there's Sue there is probably the closest to the middle.
Thanks.
Don't, by the way, in future when you come to IFG events, don't think that if you sit strategically at fifths throughout the room, you're going to get to ask all the questions.
Hi, Sue Maddock. I'm actually working at the moment with on mental health, commissioning of mental health services for the task force that's working on how to integrate the recovery and personalisation within mental health services. Just briefly, I'd like to pick up on the last thing that was Victor was talking about, because I think there's we are moving into a context now where we're not talking about public service innovation, we're talking about systems innovation. And actually that's very difficult for commissioners to get a grip on. And the most innovative things that are going on in mental health at the moment, which do involve co-design with people who are suffering mental health problems, is completely to change the framework from care and treatment to learning, and being involved in co-designed learning, which actually it is very, very exciting because it's involving people discuss what's actually happening to them in their lives, something that in our dreadful mental health services people have never done. This is outside of the kin of commissioners and is there's a huge gulf at the moment. And I really welcome what you were saying, Helen, but I think there is something like, Victor was saying, about a steer that's not just about extending the market. There are lots of creative providers, but just doing the market won't do it. We are not taking these things to scale. They're exciting, people jump on them, and then they find them really difficult to model because it takes a lot of champions and some real systems change. And we need some steer on that process, otherwise we're never going to go to scale.
Very good. There's someone in row 3 and someone in row 2. There's Fiona in row 2.
Alex Murdoch. I work at London South Bank University, I should declare that, but I used to be the equivalent of a Assistant Director of Social Services and Chair of various social care charities. It's about numbers, really. It's easy to measure inputs, and you can measure outputs to some extent, and outcomes is a hard ask. You've got an election coming next year, and when voters talk to politicians and politicians talk to voters, then it all tends to move to inputs. How many nurses, how many doctors, how many school places, how many policemen. And I think it's a hard ask trying to justify not spending so much money but getting more for it.
Fiona.
Hi, I'm Fiona Shield from New Philanthropy Capital. Being a bit of devil's advocate here, I think perhaps there's a large number of charities delivering public services who should stop delivering public services because maybe they're not that good. I think there's very little evidence about quality in any part of public services. I think also, as we know, the problems are largely systemic. We should be tackling them from a systems perspective, and not everyone is the size and clout of Leonard Cheshire and Turning Point who can do that, although you guys do really great work, so it's important that you guys keep doing that. And thirdly, obviously, it's very hard to speak to bite the hand that feeds you. So I think charities need to admit that we're very quiet in the way we talk to government about a lot of very fundamental issues. And perhaps if we stop providing services, focus more on being user advocates, on convening expertise, developing innovation outside the system and doing research, maybe ultimately we'd have a far greater impact on the quality of public services than we do when we just provide them.
Well, that's a fantastic contribution. I think we are getting to the stage where I won't even bring the panel in because we've completely run out of time. Now, these aren't the sorts of issues and topics that get solved in an evening. However, maybe a drink afterwards will think you've solved quite a lot of problems and give you a chance to continue the conversation outside. Before we do that, I should mention that the Institute for Government Collaborate, the Cabinet Office, LGA, and a huge number of other organisations are going to be working together in different ways. For example, the Institute works with the Commissioning Academy. We're going to be just part of that much wider set of developments that I'm sure that people in this room are part of as well, trying to think about how we can tackle some of these really, really knotty, complex, politicised problems. So if you can just first thank our panel for their wonderful contributions. And I'd like to thank you and say, please do join us for a drink outside.